On behalf of our organizing team, I would like to welcome you to the Risk on Webinar series on Compound Extreme. Today, Dr. Cassandra Rogers and I have the honor of hosting this webinar on the topic of disaster and public health risk. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Virginia Murray, who will be sharing her insight on UNDRR-ISC Hazard Information Profiles and their use in documenting hazards. Virginia is a distinguished public health doctor and head of global disaster risk reduction at the UK Health Security Agency, with a focus on improving health, emergency, and disaster risk management. She's also a member of Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Scientific Committee and the co-chair of IRDR's disaster loss data. Virginia, we are so excited to learn from you, and the floor is yours.
How very kind of you and wonderful of you to invite me to contribute. I'm really grateful. It's a fantastic opportunity to meet my good friends in the Knowledge Action Network. I'm so pleased to see that it is so active and so engaged in delivering such fantastic talks, some of which I've had the privilege of reviewing lately. I was very grateful to Kai for suggesting that I talk about the UNDRR, International Science Council Hazard Information Profiles, to share with you some of the work we've been trying to do that we hope will help everybody who's engaged in looking at hazards in compound events and trying to understand how we can share that knowledge together in a more useful way. And thank you for introducing me so kindly. Now, because I'm a medical doctor and a public health one, I have to start when we're talking about compound events with COVID, because I think this has been just a real shocker to everybody in the world about compound events and all the things that can happen from them. So COVID is something that we have been working on very much across the world. And I thought this image helps to share some of the impact it will have had on you, your families, your friends, your colleagues, your lifestyle, your living, and the fact that we still don't always meet to talk and to learn more from each other. The idea that the impact on the hospitals and the many healthcare beds that were needed, and the fact that people were so ill and so many died, and the impact on the hospitals for those who were not able to get healthcare is still shocking. It's been a really major issue around the world. The impact on how to improve infection prevention and control has been huge, and to document all of this in a way that could be understood, as well as sharing all the analytical skills that we needed to identify it and to determine who has been at risk and who's been exposed, and to control with lockdown and other procedures that have been very difficult, which has meant travel has been impossible for many, but not all. And then, of course, there's the huge problem of vaccinations, which I'm very glad to say are now there and are being used widely, because these are really health protective. So just to share with you something that I thought would be really useful is the message from the World Health Organization only last week, where every Ministry of Health, every Department of Health is required under the international health regulations, wherever they can, to report the data on the number of confirmed cases they have, the number of confirmed deaths, and indeed the number of vaccine doses that have been administered across the world. The fact that over 13 billion vaccine doses have been administered, I think is really important for people to be aware of. It's still not adequate, it still hasn't gone to many of the countries that need it most, but it certainly is important that we have that. But agreeing what a confirmed case is, what a confirmed death is, still remains an area of debate. But what you do have in just this one simple image, an understanding of the overview of the impact across the world. And I think this is something that is to be celebrated with the international health regulations, that we can report all together of us around the world, and that we can share the data on a daily basis as it was initially and now only about weekly. But the whole purpose is that we can really understand how these compound events can occur and how we can understand the transboundary impacts. Now, what was the real story when it started? Well, the timeline for WHO's COVID response started really on the 31st of December 2019, which is why it's known as COVID-19, not COVID-20, COVID-19. And really by the early January, guidance was prepared on a many ranges of topics, including infection prevention and control, laboratory testing, and national capacities. But it wasn't until the end of January that really the Director General declared that this novel coronavirus was a public health emergency of international concern, engaging the world with the message of the highest level of alarm. Although, for instance, in the UK, the lockdown didn't occur until late March in 2020. But what I do love is something that I think was really precious. That very early on in February, within a month of preparing the initial guidance, they had brought together 300 experts on research for coronaviruses from 48 countries and many online experts to try and agree what the priorities were for understanding what the impact might be and what the research might be needed. What was published in March 2020 was a coordinated global research roadmap, something that every hazard and compound hazard might need for the future. To me, it is a model of good practice. It talked about powering research, coordinating research, really facilitating future research actions, and committing to fair and equitable access, i.e. fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data wherever we could. So a huge achievement. And when you look at the outcome 1 year later in April 2021, you can see that each of the different areas of concern, from the virus natural history transmission to the animal environmental research, to the epidemiological studies, to the clinical characterization and management, all the way through to the ethics, as well as the candidate therapeutics and candidate vaccines, we knew who was being funded for what in an incredible network that was run by GLOPID-R, which is a global network on research for infectious diseases, along with our UK Collaborative on Disaster Research. And if you go into this website, you will see exactly which country, which area of the world, which leader of the project, who was the IP, the intellectual, the property, the person who was leading the project, all the way through to which universities were partners in it and which other organizations. But you can also see how much money was spent. And you'll notice that the candidate vaccines research got the most money when I took this screenshot a little while ago, with the total amount of funding being over $1.5 billion US. So the investment in the research for that crisis was really remarkable and very important to be aware of. But what did it also tell us? Well, there have been many reviews of COVID, and there no doubt will be many more. But this is one of the early ones that came out from the independent panel on pandemic preparedness, saying that COVID-19 make it the last pandemic. I fear not possible, but at least we had a snapshot of the consequences that I think are worth sharing if we're looking at compound events. We knew we had, by the 28th of April 2021, over 148 million cases with over 3 million deaths in 223 countries. Pretty staggering coordinated information. But many of the health workers had been affected and many died. The cost was just beginning to be understood, really looking at trillions of dollars that are going to be needed, certainly up until 2025, if not later. But I think one of the things that shocked me when I initially saw these figures was that 90% of all the world's school children were out of school for at least part of 2020. And in some cases, those children have not gone back to school. A real tragedy. And then it was reported that there was probably at least 10 million more girls who were at risk of early marriage, and gender-based violence increased fivefold with the demand of services. And of course, many pushed back, millions of people pushed back into extreme poverty. Really a shocking time that we had. And this is compound hazards at a really terrible way, but at least it was reported. Now, the independent panel went on to talk about pandemic preparedness. They reflected that multi-sectoral coordination and preparedness had been lacking. because they expected the health system to deal with all these different issues. And of course, it wasn't all health that needed help. So they talked about the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which includes pandemic risk in its purview, was not being used for disaster risk reduction capacity building, and was largely separated from the health sector in pandemic preparedness efforts, something that was really worrying. And that is why the Sendai framework remains so absolutely vitally important, that we pull together not just health, as we have in the COVID, but all the partners that are needed to respond to any compound event. So just to remind you that, of course, the development of getting us to 2015 for the Sendai framework really started in the 1980s with the International Decade of Disaster Risk Reduction and the Yokohama strategy to the Hyogo strategy. But it's interesting that the Paris Agreement really only started in 1992, which led to such an impact there. And of course, if we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the predecessor in 2000. But the anxiety to make sure all these three wonderfully visionary UN landmark agreements that are all voluntary will actually be achieved is, of course, something that causes us considerable concern, everyone working in disaster risk reduction, because, of course, all three relate to our work and to compound hazards and events. Now, you will know that the Sendai framework is a very thin little document of 50 paragraphs that have all been agreed by each of the UN member states, chaired by the UN member states. Really fascinating to see this actually happening in reality. And sitting on the sidelines, as I was part of the major group for science and technology, as I was the vice chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Group for UNISDR, as we were then. And just hearing the debates and the discussions and what could be achieved was very enriching and wonderfully learning. And I know what we did achieve was an incredible global outcome with 13 guiding principles, which included human rights, something that we all need to remember as part of the Sendai framework, with our 4 priorities of action and our 7 global targets. Each of these global targets of reducing mortality, affected people, economic loss, and damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, particularly for healthcare and education, were really critical. But also increasing our knowledge of where our national and local disaster risk reduction issues might be, along with international cooperation, leading to this incredibly important new wish, which is now being acted upon very actively, on availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments, frankly, to all the people of the world now. For instance, in the UK, this Sunday, the 23rd of April, we will be running our very first national test alert for a disaster, a hazard. It's happening at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we just hope people won't drive off the road or do anything unexpected. But we hope it'll be a way that we can then start communicating with everybody, if need be. So let's put that on one side and just reflect on the science that sits inside the Sendai framework. Because I was so involved in sitting behind on the negotiations, I had great pleasure in trying to mark in yellow where I felt that the science was very rich in the call for action in the Sendai framework. So you can see it goes fairly yellow and gets very yellow, and it stays yellow. Just in the priorities of action and understanding disaster risk alone, but throughout the document, science is called for throughout. And we as scientists, not part of the risk, can all know that we need to deliver on so much of this. And the importance of doing this remains absolutely vital, even with the midterm review, where the science is not so clearly demonstrated. Now, I had the great privilege of working very closely as the coordinating chair for the UNISDR Science and Technology Conference that we did in January 2016, where we tried to mobilize science to implement the Sendai framework, knowing there was so much science there. And what I thought was fun to share with you was that we published within 2 months a peer review article on the reflections of the science and technology agenda for disaster risk reduction. Although there are only 8 main authors here, there were well over 100 who contributed hugely, and I thank every one of the people who were engaged. It was an incredible time to get so much work done. But let's move to the Sendai Framework Monitor, which really came into its own in 2018. something that was absolutely vital that we think about. So one of the things that the Sendai Framework Monitor showed that people had real difficulty in reporting to an all hazards approach. And if you go back to paragraph 24J, to strengthen technical and scientific capacity to assess disaster risks, vulnerabilities, and exposure to all hazards, it became really apparent that we needed to be very clear on what we meant by all hazards. So every country had a better understanding of what they might want to consider and report on themselves, and also to plan for in all the different global targets and the indicators, the 38 indicators and more for some countries that might be relevant to consider. So we knew that we had done a lot of work with IRDR. You mentioned the integrated research on disaster risk, Myrna, and that was very good of you to include that link that I have, because I sit on the executive at the science committee for that group. And my colleagues from Susan Cutter and many others did a wonderful job trying to build a peril classification and hazard glossary that was published in 2013. But there was also a wonderful report that was published from the insurance industry, a taxonomy of threats for complex risk management. And taking this and other thoughts, it became absolutely apparent that we really needed to review what does all hazards mean. So I was given the great privilege of being asked to chair a UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction and the International Science Council Hazard Definition and Classification Review, and we provided our first technical report in July 2020. This was an incredible global effort, and I thank every author, every reviewer, everyone who engaged, everybody who completed the questionnaires, the surveys, and all the other things for their support. What did we do? Well, we divided the technical working group really into 4 main areas of UN organizations, and we certainly talked to well over 40 of them, but they included the World Meteorological Organization, the World Health Organization, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Telecommunications Organization, the UNESCO, and many, many others. And it was an incredibly rich and valuable experience just working with all these organizations and learning what they felt were the hazards that they were particularly concerned about. And then we had our tremendous International Science Council partners through our integrated research on disaster risk, the Committee on Data, GEO, Global Earthquake Modeling, and many, many other networks that have been absolutely invaluable. But it was UNDRR who were very keen that we should add our industrial science partners. So the Insurance Development Forum, which had been set up to bring the Sustainable Development Goals together, was also included, along with my particular concern to include the International Humanitarian Organization of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, something that I thought would be really vital for us to have. But then there were the volunteers, all the other people who contributed, and then the outreach to so many more. What an incredible experience it was to learn from many, to listen and to hear what was needed. How did we do it? Well, there's a very clear summary of what we did in our process of expanding the scope of the hazards, using the UN General Assembly agreed definitions of what a hazard is, using our data sources of the world, going through every single scientific hazard glossary we could find in English, I'm ashamed to say, the IRDR classification, and every UN glossary we could find, and the Sendai monitor hazard list, which interestingly enough includes panic. So we were a bit concerned about that as a hazard because we didn't rate that as highly as might be there. So we did our surveys, our consultations, we had inclusion criteria, and we ended up with a hazard list and a whole series of recommendations, which I can take you through. But we included, therefore, the hydromet hazards, the extraterrestrial hazards, the geohazards, the environmental hazards, the biological hazards, the chemical hazards, the technological hazards, and although not part of the Sendai framework, we were encouraged to include the societal hazards for completeness to make sure we could do that and understand what these different hazards meant. But having done that, it became apparent that we must provide the hazard information profile to explain each of these hazards and what do they mean and what are the impacts. And so for our 302 hazards, we had to go through each one from the hydromet, linking to all the clusters and understanding exactly what the issues were there, to the extraterrestrial, to the geohazards, to the environmental, to the chemical, to the biological, technological, and societal clusters to make sure that we could understand what was included. And you'll notice, for instance, in the biological hazards, we went everything from fisheries to aquaculture to chemical, biological, radiation, nuclear events, all the way through to human and animal diseases, the zoonotic diseases, and invasive species for plants and animals, and insect infestation. So just to give you a range of this, because biological hazards had not really been included in many of the hazard lists before, because it was seen to be a health domain, something not ordinary. And the technological hazards, of course, included all the cyber hazards, construction, infrastructure failure, all the way from radiation to marine and transportation, just to give you an idea of the range that we covered. Now, each hazard has its very own primary definition. It was the briefest, clearest definition we could find, preferably owned by a UN organization, something that would make it as easy as possible to understand and to use, and that it would be of the highest possible authority and applicable to all parties. Everything is open accessed, everything is open source, except for a few, which I'll explain later, some of the science papers. Underneath that, we felt it was very important, having had that definition, we needed a expanded scientific definition that would be preferably measurable, modelable, and statistically relevant, and that's still being discussed. And where we could find them, the metrics, numeric limits, or defined guidelines, preferably as a global, but possibly as a regional level. Air pollution is a classic example for that. But so in order to engage so many of the UN organizations, it became really important to include all those conventions, those UN conventions or regional conventions or multilateral treaties that UN member states have signed up to, because if they've signed up to it, then they might believe that they need to report these hazards more clearly. But for us who work in disaster risk reduction, there was a huge debate about drivers, outcomes, and risk management. Could we include that usefully? Could we make it clearer? Could we really make this available to all? And wherever we could, to have the ownership of the definitions listed at the end as the primary update, those who had the primary updating responsibility. Well, we had to find a subject matter for each of our hazards. We had to get them to write a profile if they would be happy enough to. They were reviewed by experts who had nothing to do with it, with an iterative process. And I'm ashamed to say that each one of them had to be signed off by me. So it took a very long time to do, but we did publish the whole report in October 2021, which, considering I had great difficulty spelling the Basel Convention correctly, that took a bit of time sorting that out. So there were errors like that that needed copy editing and things. So let me show you what they look like. This is the drought one, which comes very much from the WMO, very clear guidelines on definitions and monitoring of extreme weather events. And it was the 2019 version. So you can see it's there, it's clearly available. It's really useful and available to all. We had all the additional scientific descriptions, and you'll notice further down that we covered meteorological, hydrological, agricultural, and socioeconomic drought. Because, of course, drought does not have a direct effect on humans, except unless you dive into shallow water and break your neck or back. But it's all the indirect effects that affect humans that are so important to consider. I wanted to show you, we had a space weather ones, but we've also had a tsunami one. I'm very fond of the tsunami ones because we had huge support from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission from UNESCO, who were really, really helpful with us. And they not only provided a very useful information, but you can see things that I thought were really important about a tsunami, like the travel time, the arrival time, the inundation time, the idea of how big an inundation area, the height, and all the other information. There were definitions there that really make it much more statistically relevant. And for those of you who live on shorelines, particularly from New Zealand, I couldn't resist including not only the early warning systems, but the incredible blue line approach that has been taken by New Zealand, and that incredible work on trying to model where you had to run to if there should be a crisis. Now, monkeypox, of course, has been another public health emergency of international concern recently, but it's changed its name to Mpox, so we know this is already out of date. But in the very brief summary, we covered so much of what was needed for my colleagues to understand what we mean by Mpox, and was found to be very useful. And of course, we have dam failure and stampede and crushing, or we could have economic shocks and many things. But I thought I would share with you something that related to the COVID story, healthcare risk waste. Our ambition was, wherever we could, was to try and make sure everything should just be on one page of A4, front and back, as simple and as clear as we could make it, with the most important references that might be needed. So you can see the layout here that I've just described and how they look, but I thought I would take you into some of the compound effects that we see with healthcare waste. Everything from potentially harmful microorganisms that can infect hospital patients, health workers, or the general public, through to needle stick injuries, which of course is so important. We're worried about toxic exposures and from pharmaceutical products, all the way through to the issues of inadequate incineration of healthcare waste materials. And then, of course, something that's been hugely important with COVID is disposal of untreated healthcare wastes in landfills, which could potentially contaminate drinking water, surface water, and groundwater. But of course, the plastics that are in these healthcare wastes are now increasing importance. And I just wanted to go back to the idea of the geohazards, because the geohazards represented a really fascinating group that we worked on, because there was such concern that there was no UN owner of a lot of this work, although we had the International Association of Volcanology and Chemistry of the Earth's Interior, the Global Volcano Model Network, and the International Volcanic Health Hazard Network, but not a UN group to be able to answer to some of these questions. But again, you see this very simple summary that we have and trying to make it as explicit as possible, although many of the volcanic hazard information profiles have some of the best referencing I've ever found. So I didn't want to remove some of the references, but of course some of them only come from paid for sources, which I found worrying, and it's something that I still remain concerned about. But I just wanted to link you through to something that I think is just fascinating, was that I listened to a RiskCan early warning system webinar, number 13, is not all about the weather on YouTube, which Andrew Tapper did, and he talked about the fact that not having a UN owner of some of these issues really made it much harder to manage. So the recommendations that came out of this hazard information profiles and all the lists was that they should be actively engaged policymakers and scientists in evidence-based national risk assessments, disaster risk reduction, risk-informed sustainable development, and everything from managing risks of emergencies and disasters. And at this point, of course, I need to mention that COVID is only a draft hazard information profile, because we didn't know enough when we wrote it to really understand how we can make it complete. But we knew that they had to address cascading and complex hazards and risks, something that I believe is so important. And we were really concerned to have a regular review and update. And maybe it is time now for a phase 2, and that's still in discussion. But what have they achieved? They've taken those 3 UN landmark agreements that we regard as so precious for us in our vision for the future. And what they've done is to provide a common set of hazard definitions for monitoring and reviewing implementation. Something that I think is an extraordinary achievement of scientists, which is why I thank everyone so much for all their help. I just thought I'd run through a few case studies to give you some examples of how we've done some of this work. So I show you a policy brief we did for the global platform last year, and I'll take you through each one of these in turn. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the World Meteorological Office set up a Centre of Excellence for Climate and Disaster Resilience, and it was established on the 13th of October 2021. And its leadership is to provide much more strength to disaster risk reduction services, joint research policies, and capacity strengthening at many levels. And one of the things that came through very strongly was that this all came from the work that we were doing with WMO and WHO, and in those days, I worked for Public Health England, but now it's changed to UK Health Security Agency, trying to look at the mortality and economic losses from weather events. And they have been using in the future the hazard information profiles, which is very important. And one of the other things that sprung out of a lot of this work from WMO is the cataloguing of hazardous events. So we start understanding the consequences of these events. So we have all the drivers, the outcomes, and can start measuring these more clearly. So we've built a new methodology for cataloging hazardous events that link to the 2015 UN landmark agreements with a modern database methods for a hierarchy-free, no tree structure to store and facilitate flexible analysis of all the things that might relate to these events. And they are using a lot of the UNDRR International Science Council hazard information profiles to identify these hazardous events and to strengthen early warning systems as a consequence. And we have a meeting in early May to look at that further. So all the early warning systems have come through very strongly with early action after Antonio Guterres launched this whole program on the 23rd of March, 2022. And I had the privilege of being one of the 3 speakers on the early action part of the panel. And we know that it's really important that we all work together to make sure we can deliver these things. There's a huge program of work going on at the United Nations, which one of my colleagues is very much involved with, Kanza Ahmed, on the Interagency Expert Group on Disaster-Related Statistics, trying to pull together a very clear network of how we deliver some of these things. Again, they're testing and using the UNDRR Hazard Information Profiles and checking to see whether there's sufficiently clear statistical definitions. So a great achievement, and I'm really very grateful for our wonderful colleagues of Animesh Rike, Gregory, but also Michael Nagy, who works for UNECE, who's been incredible in supporting so much of this work. Now, for the WHO side, I thought it'd be interesting just to share with you that we have a WHO Health Emergency and Disaster Risk Management Framework. They have been very much involved in looking at our hazard definition, classification and review, and have been really supportive. And now we're trying to bring this together so that we bring public health to enable a whole of society actions on an all hazard risk assessment, multi-hazard early warning systems, critical information protection, infrastructure protection, and emergency preparedness and response with the delivery of health services to save lives, reduce injuries, illnesses, and other health impacts caused by emergencies and disasters. So how is this working? Well, WMO and WHO have launched a wonderful CLIMA health portal, which has all the hazard information profiles at the heart of it. And it's just got a huge research funding from the Wellcome Trust, which is fantastic. And it's just really started publishing the information late last year. So huge thanks to them. But also Desinventar is increasingly picking up on the hazard information profiles, and this is a very exciting development. And again, I thank the Bonn office of UNDRR for all their support in trying to take this forward. And there's a really exciting development in risk information exchange, another UNDRR program, which is really trying to coordinate a lot of this work. And I thank my colleagues in UNDRR and Geneva particularly for taking this forward and really testing it to see if we can do much more in understanding how we share data. Now, a lot of this was discussed at a meeting that was held in at the end of November 2022, and you can see the real enthusiasm of all the people who were there in this wonderful Bonn office of the UN, where we're looking towards delivery date for the next generation of disaster losses tracking system. And they very kindly quoted me in this particular press release about the adoption of a set of indicators associated with statistical methodologies and the launch of hazard classification and profiles of important elements to enhance the data standards to better track losses and damages. I was very thrilled that they include me there. But let's just look at one other thing that happened in March, which I was delighted to hear. They had an expert meeting on space weather at WMO, and they have been looking at the extraterrestrial hazards. Isn't that exciting? And they're certainly very interested in the space weather ones, of which there are 4 in that group. So I look forward to getting feedback from them one day. So I've talked to you a little bit about how we've used this UNDRR hazard information profiles and their use in documenting hazards. I've shown you how we've linked it to all these 3 UN landmark agreements, and indeed have looked at it and how it impacts on compound hazards such as COVID-19. We've also included how the review led to the hazard information profiles, to our understanding of which ones they are, how we've managed to use a policy brief with the WMO Atlas, to the early warning and early action group, to our health systems, to try and bring together a way of understanding what we do. There's so much more to be done, and every scientist, you're all needed. You're all better for letting us know how we can improve these, and any feedback would be so gratefully received. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia.
Sorry, Colin.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was trying to